This is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk some more about John Brown. I've been sitting here reading this book by James Redpath, and I had perused through it before, and it's fascinating reading, and it's written by an individual who knew John Brown, which is an interesting thing. And of course, sometimes when you have a friend write about you, they have a hard time writing about your faults. And it seems that James Redpath couldn't find too many faults. He called upon the angelic nature, the saintly nature of John Brown. He called upon his work on trying to free the slaves. He talked about his effort to change the world, who he corresponded with, and he did correspond with a lot of people. One of his correspondents was Frederick Douglass. And it's an interesting thing that when John Brown was captured, obviously a lot of his letters were found, and then they started going out trying to catch other people, and they went chasing after Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass escaped, by just the skin of his chin there, practically. I mean, within hours, they were after him and he had left. So it's kind of amazing to think of. And a lot of the other people that had written to John Brown or were correspondents were contacted. James Redpath, of course. But James Redpath documents much of John Brown. And you know something? You have to put this into context, because you have to remember that John Brown was in Kansas, and Kansas was sort of like the pilot plant for the American Civil War. About the best way to describe it, because basically it was a state that had two constitutions, it had two different ideologies, and basically guerrilla warfare started taking place between the two sides. And there was a lot of there wasn't just John Brown that was doing bad stuff. There was a lot of bad stuff going around, all around. But we have to say, honestly, that John Brown killed an awful lot of people in Kansas. Vigilantism, and stuff like that. And it was basically slaveholders. And I am sure that slaveholders were attacking anti-slavery contingents. But the thing is that John Brown, fresh from that, was interviewed by James Redpath, and James Redpath thought he was the best thing since, chipped beef. And he became a devotee of John Brown. And of course, John Brown would go to Harper's Ferry and create the slave revolt, which did not get far. And it wasn't just there that there were people killed. He shot a conductor on the way to Harper's Ferry, who happened to be African American. He was captured, he was hanged. Robert E. Lee was in charge, as I've mentioned before. But it's interesting because I'd like to read to you what people had to say about our friend. I have to put the glasses down so maybe I can read anymore. Here we go. And this was written by Ralph Waldo Emerson. The saint whose fate yet hangs in suspense, but whose martyrdom, if it shall be perfected, will make the gallows glorious like the cross. Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Henry D. Thoreau writes this. He was one who recognized no unjust human law, but resisted them as he was bid. No man in America has ever stood up so persistently for the dignity of human nature, knowing himself for a man and the equal of any and all governments. He could not have been tried by his peers, for his peers did not exist. And lastly, by Wendell Phillips. God makes him the text, and all he asks of our comparatively cowardly lips is to preach the sermon and say to the American people that whether that old man succeeded in a worldly sense or not, he stood a representative of law, of government, of right, of justice, of religion, and they were pirates that gathered about him and sought to wreak vengeance by taking his life. The banks of the Potomac, doubly dear now to history, will see forever on that riverside the brave old man on his pallet, whose dust, when God calls him hence, the father of his country would be proud to make room for beside his own. That was Wendell Phillips. And of course, there's endorsements by John Brown's wife and son here, in which it said that, dear friends, I am satisfied that Mr. Redpath is the man to write the life of my beloved husband, as he was personally acquainted with him, and I think will do him justice. I think that the portrait is a very good one. Respectfully yours, Mary A. Brown. And also, in 1859, in December, in fact, both of these letters are for December 1859, dear sirs, I was somewhat acquainted with James Redpath in Kansas. I am also familiar with his writings, and I consider him an able biographer, and the man above all others to write the life of my beloved father. I believe him to be a man of undoubted veracity, and fully believe that he will do justice to the work he has undertaken. Yours respectfully, Salmon Brown. And as I kind of breezed through this when I was showing you, it's kind of like a Valentine. It's sort of like when someone does a history of a president they really like. They can't really find the hard things, the bad things. There's some stuff in here. But the understanding of the author is this, that slavery is wrong. We understand that, and we agree. But you can't just use violence to fix a wrong. It's just not the way to do things. And that, unfortunately, is what John Brown did. But what John Brown did more than anything else, of course, is scare the living hell out of the South, because all of a sudden they became worried that there might be a slave revolt. And in the North, they needed somebody, because nobody was really doing too much, and the president at the time of 1859 was James Buchanan, and James Buchanan was about as useless as nothing. And he just kept talking around in circles and didn't really go anywhere except for the local liquor company to get a lot of whiskey and a lot of cigars. And that's what he would do the last year of his term, is basically drink and smoke. Drink a lot. He was definitely an alcoholic. Interesting. He had followed an alcoholic and would be followed in 1861 by a teetotaler. Very, very different. The only thing Lincoln ever drank was water, and he used to call it Adam's Ale. And interesting thing to think of. But John Brown is beloved by some people to this day. In fact, a lot of people, when they're not aware of who John Brown was, and they hear about the slave revolt, they think that he was African American. And of course he wasn't. He was a bit of a Don Quixote in his own way. He thought he was doing right, perhaps. He was doing it in God's eyes. He was very religious. And unfortunately, a lot of people lost their lives. It was the beginning of the final act of preparing for a civil war. The following year, Lincoln would be elected. The following year, the guns of Fort Sumter would be fired, and the entire world would fall apart And you know, it's true. It was more than just the United States. There was an awful lot going on around the world. Do you realize how close we were to a world war in the Civil War? Really, we're very close. We don't talk about that too much. But John Brown had a strong influence on the Union during the Civil War. In fact, they marched singing his name. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. His truth keeps marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. And he became the poster boy, in a sense, for the North to fight slavery. So, he did a lot of bad, did some good, and of course his image probably did more good than he ever dreamed he could. And that's about all I wanted to say. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.